A rancher had lived alone for years, until 7 beautiful widows arrived asking to stay the night. But what Silas Whitmore saw in their eyes on that stormy evening wasn't desperation. It was something far more dangerous. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the barren plains, rattling every loose board on Silas's weathered ranch house. He stood at his kitchen window, the coffee in his calloused hands growing cold as he watched the storm clouds swallow the last traces of daylight. For 8 years, no soul had crossed his threshold uninvited. For 8 years, he'd preferred it that way. Then came the sound of horses' hooves cutting through the rain, freezing him in place, through the sheets of water cascading from his roofs. He could make out 7 figures on horseback, their dark silhouettes bent against the wind. Women, all of them, moving with the kind of desperation that came from having nowhere else to go. Silas set down his cup with deliberate slowness. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle hanging above the fireplace, but then stopped. These weren't bandits or rust. There was something in the way they rode too close together, too coordinated, too purposeful, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The lead rider dismounted first. Even through the storm, Silas could see she was striking Auburn. Hair plastered to her face, a torn traveling dress that still looked expensive. She approached his door with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. The other 6 women remained mounted, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. But their posture spoke of women who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Mister," the woman called out, her voice cutting through the wind, "please. We need shelter for the night." Silas studied them through the glass. Something wasn't right. 7 women traveling alone through this God-forsaken territory in weather that would kill a man and their horses. Those weren't the kind of worn-out nags desperate people rode. These animals were well-fed, well-cared for. He thought of his father's words, spoken decades ago. A man's character is measured by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. But his father had never met women who carried themselves like soldiers and smiled, like they were keeping secrets. The auburn-haired woman knocked again, harder this time. "Sir, please. We won't make it to town in this storm." Silas walked to the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Every instinct screamed at him to keep that door locked. 8 years of solitude had taught him that people brought nothing but trouble and heartache. But the storm was getting worse. And even if these women were running from something or someone, he couldn't let them die on his land. His hand hovered over the door handle. Through the wood, he could hear them murmuring to each other in voices too low to make out the words, planning something. Maybe, or just trying to stay warm. What he didn't know was that the moment he opened that door, everything he thought he understood about right and wrong, about trust and betrayal, about the price of loneliness, would be tested in ways that would leave him questioning whether some acts of mercy were worth the cost. Because these 7 women hadn't found his ranch by accident, and the storm that brought them to his door was nothing compared to the one they were about to unleash inside his home. Silas opened the door, and the storm rushed in like an unwelcome guest. The auburn-haired woman stood there, water dripping from her traveling coat, but her green eyes held no gratitude-only calculation. Behind her, the other 6 women had dismounted and were leading their horses toward his barn without being asked. "Thank you," she said, stepping inside before he could change his mind. "I'm Magnolia Voss. These are my traveling companions." The way she paused before traveling companions made Celeste's jaw tighten. He watched through the doorway as the women moved with military precision, settling their horses like they'd done this 100 red times before. These weren't helpless widows caught in a storm. These were women with a plan. "Where you headed?" Silas asked, closing the door behind Magnolia but keeping his hand near his rifle. "California," she replied smoothly, removing her coat to reveal a dress. That had cost more than most men made in a year. "My husband left me property there. We're all recently wed. Thought we'd make the journey together for safety." The other women filed in one by one, each more beautiful than the last, each carrying themselves with the same strange combination of vulnerability and danger. A blonde who couldn't be more than 25, with eyes that had seen too much. A brunette, with scars on her hands that spoke of violence. Arid head who smiled too much and watched everything. They thanked him with voices like honey, but their eyes swept Hisham like they were cataloguing everything of value. The way they positioned themselves around his small living room, never with their backs to each other, always with clear paths to the door, made Silas's blood run cold. "Mighty grateful for your hospitality," said the youngest one, batting her eyelashes. "We've been riding for days. Haven't seen another soul for miles." That was a lie. Silas had seen dust clouds from riders. Earlier afternoon, maybe 3 hours. Behind these women, someone was following them, and they knew it. "Coffee is still warm," Silas offered, testing them. "Help yourselves while I see to your horses." "Oh, don't trouble yourself," Magnolia said quickly. "The animals are already settled. We're quite capable of caring for ourselves." Another red flag. Women in this territory never refused help with horses, especially in weather like this. And the way Magnolia's hand kept drifting to something hidden in the folds of her dress told Silas she was armed and ready to use whatever she was carrying. He moved to the kitchen, pouring coffee with hands that remained steady despite the alarms ringing in his shed. Through the window, he could see their horses in his barn. Fine animals with expensive tack, but foam around their mouths suggested they'd been ridden hard and fast, running from something, not traveling leisurely to California. Mighty fine place. "You have here," commented the brunette, fingering the fabric of his curtains. "Must get lonely, a man living all alone." "I prefer it that way," Silas replied, handing out in cups. Less complicated. The women exchanged glances. Quick, meaningful looks that confirmed what Silas already suspected. They weren't here by chance, and they weren't planning to lever quietly in the morning. As thunder crashed overhead, Magnolia moved to his window and peered out into the darkness. "Terrible night to be caught outside," she murmured. "Good thing we found your place when we did." But the way she was watching the road, the tension in her shoulders told Silas she wasn't worried about the storm. She was watching for Wover was following them. And when those riders arrived, because they would arrive, Silas was going to find himself caught in the middle of something that would make this storm look like a gentle breeze. What he didn't realize was That'd already made his choice the moment he opened his door, and by morning either he'd be dead or he'd discover that sometimes the most dangerous predators come disguised as helpless prey. The clock on Silas's mantle chimed 9 times, each sound echoing through the tension-filled room. The women had settled into his furniture like they owned it, but their eyes never stopped moving, never stopped calculating. Magnolia stood by the window, watching the storm with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. "Tell me about your husbands," Silas said, settling into his chair with his coffee. "What kind of men were they?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. The blonde who'd introduced herself as Pearl nearly dropped her cup. The redhead's smile faltered for the first time since she'd walked in. But Magnolia turned from the window with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "Dead men," she said simply. "The kind that don't bear discussing." Silas nodded slowly, studying each face. Funny thing about widows in this territory, most of them wear black. Most of them travel with family or other folks from their town. Most of them don't carry guns under their dresses. The brunette Clara shifted in her seat, and Silas caught the glint of metal beneath her skirts. "A woman alone has to protect herself," she said defensively. "7 women alone," Silas corrected. 7 beautiful women with expensive horses, fine clothes, and no weapons between them to outfit a small army. That's not widows heading to California. That's something else entirely. The youngest one, who'd barely spoken since arriving, suddenly stood up. Her hands were shaking, and tears were streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I can't keep lying." "Sit down, Rose," Magnolia commanded, her voice sharp as broken glass. But Rose shook her head, backing toward the door. "He's be anything but kind to us, and we're going to." She couldn't finish the sentence. The temperature in the room dropped. 10. Every woman was now staring at Rose with expressions that ranged from fury to fear. Silas felt his hand move slowly toward his rifle, understanding, finally, crystallizing in his mind like ice forming on winter water. "Going to what, Rose?" he asked quietly. Before Rose could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through the storm. Multiple riders coming fast despite the weather. Magnolia spun to the window, her face going pale. "They found us," she breathed. The other women leaped at our feet, suddenly revealing an arsenal of weapons that had been hidden beneath their feminine facades. Derringers, knives, even a soft shotgun that the redhead pulled from beneath her traveling coat. "Who found?" "You," Silas demanded, rising from his chair. Magnolia turned to face him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Manuel don't take kindly to being robbed," she said. "Men who've been tracking us for 3 days across 2 territories." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. These weren't widows. They were thieves, con artists, and they'd led a gang of vengeful men straight to his door. "How much did you steal?" Silas asked. "Enough to make them very, very hungry." Magnolia replied. The horses were getting closer. Through the storm, Silas could hear shouting, rough voice squalling out threats and promises of violence. Rose was sobbing now, and the other women were checking their weapons with the practiced efficiency of people who'd killed before. But what none of them knew was Silas hadn't told anyone in 8 long years, was that before he'd become a hermit rancher, he'd been something else entirely. Something that might just keep them all alive through the night if he decided they were worth saving. The riders burst into Silas' yard like demons emerging from hell. Through the rowan-ashed windows, he counted at least 8 men, maybe more. Their leader, a massive figure in a black coat, dismounted and began barking orders that cut through the storm like knife blades. "Spread out. Check the barn. If they're here, I want them alive." Magnolia grabbed Silas's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "Please," she whispered, all pretense finally stripped away. They'll kill you, Sul, if they find us. Silas looked into her eyes and saw something he recognized. The particular kind of terror that came from knowing exactly what men were capable of when they felt wronged. He'd seen that look before, in mirrors, and in the faces of people he'd failed to save. "What did you take from them?" he asked. "Money," Clarence would. "A lot of money from their poker game in Deadwood." "How much?" "Enough to buy a small town," Pearl whispered. Rose was curled in the corner, rocking back and forth. "They're going to do terrible things to us," she moaned. "Things worse than dying." The pounding on Silas's door made everyone jump. The voice that followed was grilly, dangerous, and absolutely certain of its own power. "Open up, Weno, you're in there." Silas looked at the 7 women, really looked at them. Beneath their beauty and their weapons, beneath their lies and their desperation, he saw something that reminded him of his sister. His sister Woe died because no one had been there to protect her when bad men came calling. If you were Silas, what would you do? Turn over 7 thieves who had deceived you and brought danger to your door, or risk everything to protect women? Woe might be killers themselves, but were certainly about to become victims. Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd cut. Choose, because what Silas decided next would determine whether anyone in that room lived to see morning. He reached for his rifle, then stopped. Instead, he moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pulled it up, revealing a cache of weapons that made the women's arsenal look like children's toys. Military rifles, ammunition, and something else that made Magnolia's eyes widen in recognition. "You're not just a rancher," she breathed. "Used to be a marshal, Selassie, checking the loads on a repeating rifle. Before I decided civilization wasn't worth saving." The door exploded inward, splinters flying like shrapnel. The first man through was built like a mountain, with scars that told stories, a feelance and eyes that promised more of the same. Behind him came others, hard men with harder faces, the kind who'd sold their mothers for a good horse and a bottle of whiskey. Well, the leader said, water dripping from his black hat. "Silas Whitmore. Heard you'd gone soft, hiding out here playing for mayor." "Hello, Cormac," Silas replied, his voice steady as stone. "Still collecting debts for people too cowardly to do their own dirty work." Cormac Doolan. Silas should have known. The manwo'd made a career out of finding people who didn't want to be found and making them wish they'd never been born. The fact that he was here meant these women had stolen from someone with serious connections. "Hand over Thelides, Silas, and we'll be on our way. This doesn't have to involve you." "Afraid it already does," Silas said, positioning himself between Cormac and the women. "They asked for shelter. I gave my word." Cormac laughed, a sound like gravel in a coffee grinder. "Your word too, a bunch of thieving _ they robbed the wrong man." Silas took money that belongs to people who don't forgive and don't forget. Then they should have been more careful about who they played cards with. "Hand them over, or we'll take them along with everything else you own." Silas met Cormac's gaze without flinching. "You can try." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence. 8 armed men against 1 aging lawman and 7 desperate women. The odds were terrible, the situation hopeless, and the storm outside seemed gentle compared to the one about to break inside that small ranch house. But Cormac didn't know about the secret that Silas had been carrying for 8 years. The reason he'd left civilization behind. And when the shooting started, that secret was going to turn this from Amaseka into something much more interesting. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Cormac's men had spread through Silas's home, their weapons trained. On the group of women huddled behind the former marshal, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the violence to begin. "You know, Silas," Cormac said, pulling off his wet gloves with deliberate slowness, "I heard some interesting stories about why you really left the marshal service. Something about a bank robbery in Silver Creek. Something about evidence that went missing." Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Behind him, he could feel Magnolia's eyes boring into his back, reassessing everything she thought she knew about her reluctant protector. "Oh yes," Cormac continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Seems there was money that never made it back to the bank. A lot of money. Makes a man wonder how a simple lawman could afford to buy a spread like this." "You're fishing in empty waters, Cormac." "Am I?" Cormac gestured to his men, and they raised their weapons. "See, the way I figure it, you and these ladies have something in common. You're all thieves. On differences, you got away with it." Rose let out a sob from the corner, and Pearl gripped her derringer so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Clara was calculating angles, looking for any advantage, while the red-haired Faye seemed almost excited by the prospect of violence. But it was Magnolia who surprised everyone. She stepped forward, moving past Silas's protective stance to face Cormac directly. "The money we took," she said quietly. "It wasn't just sitting in some poker game. It was payment for girls. Young girls bought and sold like cattle." The room went dead silent. Even Cormac's men exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We didn't steal from gamblers," Magnolia continued, her voice growing stronger. "We stole from men who trade in human misery. Men who destroy innocence for profit. That's a pretty story." Cormac sneered. Boot something in his voice had changed. "Doesn't change the fact that you took something that doesn't belong to you." "It never belonged to them either." Clara spoke up, her own weapon now visible. "Every dollar was paid for with a child's tears." Silas looked at the women with new understanding. Not just thieves, vigilantes, taking justice into their own hands when the law failed to act. It explained the coordination, the weapons training, the careful planning. These women weren't running toward California. They were running toward redemption. "Makes no difference to me," Cormac said. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "A job's a job. Money's money." "Even blood money?" Silas asked. "Especially blood money pays better." That's when Silas made his choice. Not just to protect 7 women, but to stand against something that had poisoned his dreams for years. The Samivel he'd failed to stop in Silver Creek. The same darkness that had driven him into isolation. He moved with the speed of a man 20 years younger. The rifle in his hand, speaking before Cormac could draw his weapon. Thibalet took the big man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. "Anyone else want to die beneath morality of child trafficking?" Silas asked, working the lever on his rifle. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The remaining men found themselves facing not just a former marshal with a lifetime of experience, but 7 women who'd already proven they were willing to kill for what they believed in. The odds had just shifted dramatically, and the storm outside was about to seem peaceful compared to the reckoning that was coming. The gunfight erupted like a thunderclap. Cormac's men, caught off guard by Silas's sudden violence and their revelation about their employers, hesitated for a crucial second. That hesitation cost them everything. Magnolia's derringer barked twice, dropping the man nearest the door. Pearl and Clara moved like dancers, their weapons finding targets with deadly precision. Faye laughed as she fired, a sound more terrifying than any scream. Only Rose remained huddled in the corner, sobbing as violence exploded around her. Silas worked his rifle like a man possessed, each shot deliberate and final. Years of isolation had done anything to dull his skills as a lawman. If anything, the solitude had sharpened his focus, refined his purpose. Fazemen had come to his home to collect human cargo. They would leave as corpses. Fall back, Cormac screamed, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder. Fall back to the horses. But there was nowhere to run. The storm outside had intensified, turning the world beyond the ranch house into a howling void. And inside, 7 women and 1 former marshal had turned his modest home into a killing ground. One of Cormac's men tried to use Rossi as a shield, grabbing the sobbing girl and pressing a knife to her throat. "Drop your weapons or she dies." That's when Silas saw something that made his blood freeze. On the man's wrist, barely visible beneath his dirty sleeve, was Abram. A mark he'd seen before in Silver Creek, on the wrist of a dead girl who couldn't have been more than 14. The same mark these women had been fighting against. "You know what that symbol means, don't you?" Magnolia called out, seeing Silas's recognition. "You've seen it before." Silas had indeed seen it before, on victims, on evidence that had mysteriously disappeared, on corpses that had been written off as accidents or suicides. The mark of an organization that treated human beings like livestock, that bought and sold innocence to the highest bidder. "Silver Creek," he whispered, understanding flooding through him. "That's why the evidence disappeared. That's why Thakis got buried." "Your own people were involved," Clara confirmed, her weapon still trained on Cormac. "Judges, sheriffs, politicians, all bought and paid for." The man holding Rose pressed his knife closer to her throat. "I said, drop your weapons." Instead, Silas did something that shocked everyone in the room. He set down his rifle and reached into his shirt, pulling out a small metal badge. Not his marshal's star, something else. Something that made Cormac's eyes widen in recognition and fear. "Federer." "Marshal," Silas said quietly. "Special Division. I've been hunting your organization for 8 years." The room went dead silent except for the storm raging outside. Cormac stared at the badge like it was a poisonous snake. "The Hermit Act," Magnolia breathed. "It was all cover." "Deep cover," Silas confirmed, his eyes never leaving the man holding Rose. "Waiting for the right moment to strike at the heart of this thing." "You son of a _ Cormac snarled. "You've been playing the long game." 8 years, Silas repeated. 8 years of watching, learning, mapping your entire network. Your employers, your routes, your buyers, every name, every location, every transaction. The man with the knife was sweating now, realizing he was Cordpuin. Federal justice and 7 women who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill. His hand trembled as he pressed the blade against Rose's pale throat. "Let her go," Silas said softly, "and I'll make sure you live long enough to testify." "Against who?" the man demanded. "Everyone. Every politician who took your money. Every judge who looked the other way. Every sheriff who buried evidence. I've got 8 years of documentation hidden where your bosses will never find it. You're lying. Silas smiled, and it was the coldest expression anyone in that room had ever seen. Try me. The man's resolve cracked. His knife wavered, and in that moment of weakness, Rose proved she was stronger than anyone had imagined. She drove her elbow into his stomach and broke free, leaving him exposed to 7 very angry women with very loaded guns. What happened next would haunt Cormac's dreams for the rest of his very short life. The man who'd held Rose Hesjedid before he hit the floor. 7 weapons spoke as one, turning him into a cautionary tale about underestimating purse women. The sound echoed through the ranch house like divine judgment, final and absolute. Cormac, bleeding and broken, looked around at the carnage that had been his crew. Bodies sprawled across Silas furniture, their blood soaking into wood floors that had seen 8 years of peaceful solitude. Only 2 of his men remained alive, both wounded, both staring at the federal badge in Silas's hand like it held their death. Warrens, you played useful, Cormac wheezed, clutching his shoulder. The whole time you were Federer. The whole time you were scum, Silas replied, holstering his weapon. The difference is, I was doing my job. Magnolia lowered her smoking derringer. Her green eyes studying Silas with new respect. 8 years of watching children disappear. 8 years of building a case. That takes a special kind of patience. That takes a special kind of rage. Silas corrected. Controlled rage. The kind that doesn't burn out. It just burns deeper. Rose had stopped. Crying. She stood over the body of her woodbed killer, her young face transformed by something harder than grief, cleaner than vengeance. How many girls? She asked quietly. How many what? Cormac asked. How many girls did your bosses buy and sell? How many innocents paid for your blood money? Cormac tried Tola, but it came out as a cough that sprayed blood across his lips. You think killing us stops anything? You think this ends it? No, Silas said, kneeling beside the wounded man. This is just the beginning. See, I didn't spend 8 years just watching. I spent 8 years documenting names, dates, transactions, locations, every piece of your operation mapped out in detail. Where? Cormac demanded. Safe, Silas replied. Federal custody. And now that you've confirmed my intelligence by coming here tonight, by admitting Waithy's women stole, by wearing those brands on your wrists, well, now I have everything I need to bring down Thien to your network. Clara moved to the window, checking for more writers. Is this really over? She asked. For us, yes, Magnolia said, finally allowing herself to believe it. But for them, she looked at Silas. What happens to the men at the top? The ones who never dirtied their own hands. They fall, Silas said simply. All of them. Federal marshals are already moving on safe houses in 3 territories. By morning, the organization that destroyed so many lives will be nothing but a memory. The storm outside was finally beginning to break. Through the shattered door, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of hope and redemption. Butte inside the ranch house, among the bodies and the blood, 7 women and 1 federal marshal sat in the aftermath of their own small war. What about us? Pearl asked. We're still thieves. Westall took money that wasn't ours. Evidence money, Silas corrected. Confiscated as part of a federal investigation. You ladies just helped execute a warrant. Faye laughed. The sound lighter now, cleaner. So we're heroes. You're survivors, Silas said. And sometimes that's the same thing. Booter's the morning light grew stronger, revealing the full scope of the carnage in his home. Silas wondered if any of them would ever truly escape the darkness they'd fought against. Victory had a price, and sometimes that price is measured in pieces of your soul that could never be recovered. The real question was whether what they'd saved was worth what they'd lost in the saving. The sun climbed higher, painting Silas's ranch in golden light that seemed almost obscene after the violence of the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, while inside the ranch house, the evidence of their small war remained in pools of blood and the smell. Of gunpowder, Cormac had died during the night. His last words a curse directed at no one in particular. His surviving men sat bound and broken, awaiting the federal marshals that Silas had already signaled would be coming. The network that had terrorized innocents across 3 territories was finished, but the cost of that victory sat heavy in Thurmaning. Rose had found her voice again. What happens to us now? She asked. No longer the frightened girl Woad sobbed in the corner. The night had changed her, hardened her in ways that might prove valuable or dangerous. You disappear, Silas replied, cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of Eamon, who understood the importance of maintenance. New names, new lives, new... The federal government has resources for that kind of thing. Together or separate? Magnolia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Your choice. But understand, you can never be Thes people again. The women who walked into this house last night are dead. What walks out are entirely new creations. Clara nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that truth. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe those women needed to die. The sound of approaching horses made everyone tense. But these riders came in daylight with federal badges and official papers. The cleanup crew had arrived to process the scene, to make the bodies disappear. To transform a night of violence into a series of bureaucratic reports that would gather dust in government filing cabinets. Federal Marshal Williams, the lead writer, announced, dismounting with military precision. You signaled the operation was complete and successful. Silas confirmed. The network is broken. The evidence is secure. These ladies are under Fed EARAL protection. Marshal Williams studied the 7 women with the calculating gaze of a man who'd seen too much of human nature, Tobe surprised by anything. They'll need new identities, complete backgrounds. It's expensive work. They earned it, Silas said firmly. Booed payment, the most expensive kind. As the Federan team began their work, processing Thessany with efficient brutality, the 7 women prepared to say goodbye to the man who'd saved their lives, and possibly their souls. But Rose hung back, approaching Silas with something like shyness. The money we stole, she said quietly. What really happens to it? What would you like to happen to it? There are places, she whispered. Safe places for girls who've been hurt. Places that need funding, need protection, need someone to care about them. Silas nodded, understanding. I'll make sure it finds its way to the right hands. Magnolia was the last to approach him. "You could have turned us in," she said. "Collected the reward. Money, lived peacefully ever after." "Peace isn't something you achieve," Silas replied. "It's something you choose every day with every decision. Last night, I chose to stand with people who were trying to protect innocence. That's as close to peace as men like me ever get. What about you? What happens to the federal marshal when this is over?" Silas looked around his ranch, blood-stained now, forever changed by the violence it had witnessed. "I think Makova is blown," he said with something that might have been a smile. "Time to find a new mission." The women left Acid Morning Sun reached its peak, riding toward new lives with new names and the kind of future that few people get. To choose for themselves, they disappeared into the vast territory like smoke dissipating in clean air, leaving behind in the memories and the knowledge that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Silas stood in his doorway, watching them ride away, thinking about 8 years of patient waiting in one night of decisive action. The house behind him would need cleaning, rebuilding, exercising. But for the first time in nearly a decade, he felt something like satisfaction. Sometimes the best victories were the ones that left scars. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by people with nothing left to lose. And sometimes mercy and justice walked hand in hand a dusty road, leaving the world a little cleaner than they'd found it. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. The rancher, who'd lived alone for years, had opened his door to 7 beautiful strangers, and in doing so had found his way back to the man he'd always meant to be. In a world where innocence was bought and sold, where corruption ran deeper than anyone imagined, 7 women and 1 federal marshal had proven that some things were still worth fighting for. And that was a lesson worth remembering in any territory, in any time. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, where justice rides a darker trail and the price of redemption demands more than anyone expects to pay. Click on the video.